Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen was everything a Victorian gentleman should be. Soft-spoken, well-dressed, impeccably polite. His neighbors in Camden Road, North London, knew him as a devoted husband who doted on his flamboyant wife, Cora. He was the kind of man who tipped his hat to ladies, never raised his voice, and seemed incapable of swatting a fly. So when he appeared at his front door in July 1910, wearing his wife's diamond brooch pinned to his lapel, the neighbors were confused. When he started giving away Cora's expensive furs and jewelry to friends, explaining that his dear wife had died suddenly in America, they were concerned. And when young Ethel Leneve moved into the house and began wearing the dead woman's clothes, they were suspicious. You see, intent isn't always written in blood or screamed in rage. Sometimes it whispers in drawing rooms, hides behind respectable facades, and wears the mask of grief while disposing of evidence one piece of jewelry at a time. Intent. It's what separates accident from murder, passion from premeditation, justice from revenge. It is not the act itself, but the intent behind it that makes it a crime. Today on Deadly Intent, we're exploring a case that shocked Edwardian London and changed criminal investigation forever. Dr. Crippen's intent wasn't just to commit murder, it was to commit the perfect murder, to erase his wife so completely that he could build a new life on her grave. What he didn't count on was that the same modern technology that made his crime possible would also make his capture inevitable. I'm Carman Carrion, and if you're just joining us on Deadly Intent, welcome to a journey into the darkest corners of human intention. We're not just here to explore the what and how of famous crimes. We're here to understand the why, because intent is what transforms an accident into a tragedy, a moment of weakness into a calculated crime, and sometimes, as we'll see today, respectability into the perfect cover for murder. The case of Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen is fascinating, not just because of the crime itself, but because of what it reveals about the collision between old world manners and new world technology. In 1910, London was still very much a Victorian city in its sensibilities, proper, hierarchical, trusting of authority figures like doctors. But it was also on the cusp of the modern age, with innovations like wireless communication beginning to shrink the world. Crippen understood the Victorian part perfectly. He knew that a respectable doctor's word would be trusted, that his gentle demeanor would disarm suspicion, that society's reluctance to probe too deeply into a gentleman's private affairs would provide cover for his crime. What he didn't understand was how quickly the modern world could reach across oceans to drag him back to face justice. This case has everything. A marriage destroyed by ambition and infidelity, a love affair that demanded the ultimate sacrifice, a murder so calculated it required dismemberment and burial in a basement, and a chase across the Atlantic that captivated the world. But underneath all the drama, this is really a story about the intent to have it all: love, respectability, and freedom, and the terrible price Crippen was willing to pay to achieve that goal. 1910, London, 39 Hilldrop Crescent, Camden. A respectable middle-class address that housed one of the most dysfunctional marriages in Victorian history. Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen was 48 years old, a small, balding man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the gentle manner of a scholarly clerk. He had been born in Michigan, but had settled in London permanently to practice as a homeopathic doctor. His credentials were questionable at best. He had never been licensed to practice in Britain, and his American qualifications came from what was barely more than a diploma mill. Still, he managed to maintain a respectable practice through his association with Munyon's homeopathic remedies, managing their London operations while treating wealthy patients who preferred natural treatments. The real drama in Crippen's life wasn't his medical practice. It was his marriage to Kunigunda Makamotsky, better known as Cora Crippen, or by her stage name, Belle Elmore. If Crippen was quiet and self-effacing, preferring to blend into the background, Cora was his exact opposite. She was loud, flamboyant, ambitious, and absolutely determined to make it as a music hall performer. She was everything Victorian society said a proper wife shouldn't be. She wore flashy clothes, performed on stage for money, stayed out late, and had what her neighbors politely called bohemian friends. Their marriage was a disaster from the beginning. Cora pursued her theatrical dreams with single-minded determination, taking voice lessons, attending auditions, and socializing with other aspiring performers. She served as a treasurer for the Music Hall Ladies Guild and spent money lavishly on clothes, jewelry, and her constant attempts to buy her way into better theatrical opportunities. How these two incompatible souls found each other is a story that perfectly captures the collision between Victorian propriety and modern ambition. They met in New York City in 1892, when Crippen was working as a dubious medical practitioner, and Cora was trying to establish herself as a performer. Cora, then using the name Charlotte Bell, had been working as a chorus girl and occasional singer in the seedier music halls of Manhattan. She was married at the time to a man named Stanton, but that marriage was already crumbling under the weight of her theatrical ambitions and his inability to support her expensive tastes. Crippen encountered her when she came to his medical office seeking treatment, possibly for a stage injury, though the exact circumstances are lost to history. What we do know is that the mild-mannered doctor was completely captivated by this brash, confident woman who represented everything he had never dared to be himself. For Cora, Crippen must have seemed like salvation. Here was a respectable professional man who not only accepted her theatrical aspirations, but seemed willing to finance them. After her divorce from Stanton was finalized, she married Crippen in 1892, bringing to the union her stage ambitions and very little else. It was a marriage born of mutual need rather than mutual understanding. He needed someone to make him feel alive and important. She needed someone to bankroll her dreams. That fundamental mismatch would poison their relationship from the very beginning, creating the resentment that would eventually drive Crippen to murder. The cracks in their marriage appeared almost immediately and widened with each passing year. Crippen had expected marriage to transform Cora into a grateful, devoted wife who would appreciate his financial support and abandon her theatrical pursuits. Instead, she took his money and used it to chase her dreams even more aggressively, treating him less like a beloved husband and more like a convenient banker. Cora, for her part, had expected Crippen to be content financing her ambitions from the shadows, while she pursued fame and social status. She grew increasingly contemptuous of his quiet, scholarly manner, his lack of social connections, and his failure to advance his career through his own influence. What had once seemed like genteel respectability now struck her as weakness and social irrelevance. By the time they moved to London in the late 1890s, they were living essentially separate lives under the same roof. Cora spent her evenings at theatrical gatherings and music hall guild meetings, while Crippen retreated into his medical practice and books. The passionate mutual need that had brought them together had curdled into mutual disappointment and barely disguised contempt. This was the poisonous atmosphere that prevailed when, in 1905, Crippen made a decision that would seal all their fates. He hired a young typist named Ethel Leneve to work in his office and suddenly found himself building a very different kind of relationship. Ethel was everything Cora wasn't: quiet, deferential, grateful for attention, and willing to worship Crippen as the brilliant doctor he pretended to be. Ethel was 23 when she started working for Crippen, a plain-faced girl from a working-class family who was thrilled to have a respectable job in a doctor's office. She saw Crippen not as the failed medical practitioner his colleagues knew him to be, but as a distinguished gentleman who had chosen to notice her. The relationship that developed between them was classic Victorian melodrama: the older, married man and the innocent young secretary, complete with secret meetings, passionate letters, and elaborate deceptions. By 1910, the situation had become intolerable. Cora was openly contemptuous of Crippen, frequently humiliating him in front of guests. She had begun talking about returning to America permanently, which would have meant either abandoning Ethel or facing the scandal of a wife who had publicly left him. Ethel, meanwhile, was growing tired of being the secret mistress. She wanted marriage, respectability, a future that didn't involve hiding in shadowy tea rooms. And that's when Crippen's intent crystallized. He didn't just want to be free of his marriage. He wanted to be free of Cora entirely. He wanted her gone, erased, eliminated so completely that he could build a new life without her shadow hanging over it. What he didn't realize was that getting everything he wanted would require not just murder, but the complete obliteration of another human being. Let's pause here and consider what we know about Crippen's intent. This wasn't about escaping an abusive marriage or defending himself against violence. Crippen wasn't trapped. He could have divorced Cora, accepted the scandal, and started over. He could have left London entirely, moved to another city where his questionable credentials wouldn't be scrutinized. But none of those options gave him what he really wanted: respectability without consequences. Crippen's intent was fundamentally about control. Control over how others perceived him. Control over his social standing. Control over his romantic life. He wanted to be seen as a grieving widower, deserving of sympathy, not a failed husband who'd been publicly humiliated by his theatrical wife. This desire for complete control would drive every decision he made, from the method of murder to the elaborate cover-up that followed. He wasn't just planning to kill Cora. He was planning to rewrite history itself, to create a version of events where he emerged as the sympathetic figure rather than the villain. But there's something else at work here: the arrogance of assumed superiority. Crippen believed his medical knowledge, his gentle demeanor, and his understanding of social conventions made him smarter than everyone around him, including the police. That arrogance would prove to be his fatal flaw. January 31st, 1910, the last day anyone outside of 39 Hilldrop Crescent would see Cora Crippen alive. It was a Tuesday evening, and the Crippens were hosting what would become one of the most scrutinized dinner parties in criminal history. Their guests were Paul and Clara Martinetti, retired music hall performers who were among Cora's closest friends. The evening seemed perfectly ordinary: good food, conversation about theatrical gossip, plans for upcoming Music Hall Ladies Guild events. Clara Martinetti would later testify that Cora seemed her usual vivacious self, talking animatedly about her plans to visit friends in America. The Martinettis left around 1:30 a.m. on February 1st. They were the last people, other than Crippen himself, to see Cora alive. What happened next would remain Crippen's secret for months, but we can reconstruct the sequence from physical evidence. Sometime in the early morning hours of February 1st, Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen murdered his wife. The method was typically Crippen, calculated, clinical, designed to minimize struggle and noise. As a doctor, he had access to drugs unavailable to ordinary people. The autopsy would later reveal traces of hyoscine hydrobromide in Cora's remains, a powerful sedative that was lethal in large doses. Hyoscine was perfect for Crippen's purpose. It was relatively easy to obtain through medical supply companies, odorless and nearly tasteless when dissolved in alcohol, and it would cause unconsciousness before death. Most importantly, it wasn't something that would show up in a routine examination. Investigators would have to specifically test for it. The timing suggests Crippen drugged Cora sometime after the guests left, probably by offering her a nightcap. She would have become drowsy and confused before losing consciousness entirely. When he was certain she was dead, Crippen began the most horrifying part of his plan. He dismembered her body. This wasn't a crime of passion followed by panic. This was premeditated butchery, carried out with surgical precision in the basement of their home. Crippen had planned this aspect carefully, preparing tools, choosing a location, working out every detail of how to make a human body disappear. The basement at 39 Hilldrop Crescent became Crippen's operating theater. Using his medical knowledge, he systematically dismembered Cora's body, removing organs, separating limbs, reducing what had once been a living person to manageable pieces. The torso and organs were buried in quicklime in the basement, underneath the brick floor that Crippen carefully replaced and disguised. The head, limbs, and bones were disposed of separately, probably burned in the house's furnace over several days. The next morning, February 2nd, Crippen went to work as usual. He told Ethel that Cora had received urgent news from America and had left suddenly. He seemed calm, collected, slightly relieved, the demeanor of a man who had finally solved a long-standing problem. Over the following days, Crippen began implementing his carefully planned cover story. Crippen's cover-up was almost as elaborate as the murder itself. He sent resignation letters to Cora's organizations, signed with her name. He told friends and neighbors she had been called away suddenly. He even sent himself telegrams supposedly from Cora in America, which he shared as proof that she had arrived safely. But then Crippen made his first major mistake. Instead of maintaining the fiction that Cora was still alive but absent, he decided to accelerate his timeline. On February 20th, just 19 days after the murder, he announced that Cora had died suddenly in America from pneumonia. This was too convenient, too fast, too final. More suspicious still, Crippen claimed she had been cremated immediately, so there would be no body to return to London. But Crippen's most damning mistake was what he did next. Almost immediately after announcing Cora's death, he began openly displaying his relationship with Ethel Leneve. She started appearing at social functions as his companion. She moved into 39 Hilldrop Crescent. Most shocking of all, she began wearing Cora's jewelry and clothing in public. Victorian society could accept a grieving widower finding comfort with a younger woman after a decent interval. What they couldn't accept was a man who seemed to be celebrating his wife's death by parading her replacement in the dead woman's jewelry. Clara Martinetti, who had been one of Cora's closest friends, was especially troubled. She had attended that final dinner party, heard Cora's plans for America, and been at the guild meeting where Crippen announced the sudden death. Something felt wrong. When she saw Ethel Leneve wearing Cora's distinctive brooch at a guild function in March, her suspicions crystallized into certainty. She was looking at a woman wearing a dead friend's jewelry, and the dead friend's husband was acting more like a man who had been freed than bereaved. Clara Martinetti decided to go to the police. When Clara Martinetti walked into Scotland Yard on June 30th, 1910, she was about to launch one of the most famous criminal investigations in British history. The officer who took her statement was Inspector Walter Dew, a veteran detective who'd worked the Jack the Ripper murders. Dew's initial reaction was skeptical, but something about Clara's story caught his attention. The speed of Cora's supposed death, the immediate appearance of the secretary in the dead woman's jewelry, and the complete absence of independent confirmation that Cora had ever reached America. The first thing Dew did was request documentation from Crippen. Where were the death certificates? What were the details of the cremation? Could Crippen provide the name of the hospital where his wife had supposedly died? This is where Crippen's carefully constructed fiction began to unravel. He provided vague answers, conflicting details, and documentation that looked suspiciously like it had been created on his own typewriter. When Dew contacted American authorities to verify the death, they could find no record of Cora Crippen dying, being cremated, or even entering the country in early 1910. On July 8th, Inspector Dew decided to pay a visit to 39 Hilldrop Crescent for what he described as a routine inquiry. This was Crippen's opportunity to maintain his innocence, to provide convincing explanations for the discrepancies. Instead, he panicked. Dew later described the interview as surreal. Crippen was polite, helpful, and completely unconvincing. He changed his story multiple times within an hour. First, Cora had died of pneumonia in California, then New York. Then he admitted he wasn't sure exactly where she had died because they'd been estranged. But the most damaging moment came when Dew asked to see Cora's room. Crippen led him upstairs and showed him a bedroom that had clearly been stripped of all personal belongings. When Dew asked about Cora's clothes and jewelry, Crippen explained that he'd given them away because keeping them was too painful. This struck Dew as odd. Most grieving widowers keep at least some mementos. The clothes and jewelry were worth considerable money, not items most people would casually dispose of. And several neighbors had mentioned seeing Ethel wearing what appeared to be Cora's distinctive pieces. Dew left convinced he was dealing with something more serious than a domestic dispute. He arranged for surveillance and began preparing for a more thorough investigation. But when he returned 2 days later with a search warrant, he discovered that both Crippen and Ethel had vanished. The house was empty, except for scattered belongings and a note explaining that Crippen had been called away on urgent business. The search of 39 Hilldrop Crescent that followed was methodical and thorough. Dew and his team examined every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. They found evidence of hasty departure, clothes left behind, important papers abandoned, cash hidden in various locations, but they found no trace of Cora Crippen. Then they went down to the basement. The basement was typical for a London middle-class home. Stone walls, brick floor, used for storage and heating. But Inspector Dew noticed something crucial. Some bricks in the floor looked newer than others, with slight variations in mortar that suggested recent work. When they lifted those suspicious bricks, they found loose earth underneath. And when they dug into that earth, they made a discovery that would shock even experienced Scotland Yard investigators. Buried in quicklime, wrapped in a man's pajama top and a piece of ladies' underwear, were the decomposed remains of what once had been a human torso. The head, arms, and legs were missing, but what remained was clearly the trunk of a woman who had been systematically dismembered. Dr. Augustus Pepper, one of London's leading forensic pathologists, was called in to examine the remains. His analysis would become a landmark in forensic science, demonstrating how modern scientific methods could extract crucial evidence from severely decomposed remains. Pepper's first challenge was determining the sex of the victim. The body had been buried for months and was badly decomposed, but he was able to identify distinctly female anatomical features. More importantly, he found a surgical scar from an abdominal operation that Cora was known to have undergone. But the most damning evidence came from toxicological analysis. Despite the decomposition and quicklime, Pepper was able to detect traces of hyoscine hydrobromide in the remains. This was a drug that few people outside the medical profession would have access to, and fewer still would know how to use as poison. The discovery transformed the case from missing person to murder inquiry. Scotland Yard issued an international warrant for Crippen's arrest. What they discovered was that Crippen had planned his escape almost as carefully as the murder. On July 9th, the day after Dew's first visit, Crippen had purchased tickets for passage to Canada aboard the SS Montrose, but he hadn't booked passage for himself and Ethel as husband and wife. He had booked passage for John Philo Robinson and his son, John Robinson Jr. Ethel Neve had disguised herself as a teenage boy, cutting her hair short and wearing men's clothing. The plan was to travel to Canada as father and son, then disappear into the vast wilderness where British authorities would never find them. It was a clever plan, and it might have worked if it had been 1850 instead of 1910. Captain Henry Kendall of the SS Montrose was an avid reader of newspapers and a careful observer of his passengers. When he read about the Crippen case in papers picked up at port, he began watching the Robinson family more closely. The boy seemed unusually affectionate with his father, holding hands and whispering intimately. More suspicious still, young Robinson had a distinctly feminine way of moving. On July 22nd, Captain Kendall sent what would become one of the most famous wireless messages in history. Have strong suspicions that Crippen London cellar murderer and accomplice are among saloon passengers. Mustache taken off, growing beard. Accomplice dressed as boy. Manner and build undoubtedly a girl. This message electrified Scotland Yard and the British press. For the first time, modern technology was being used to track fleeing criminals across international waters. Inspector Dew immediately boarded a faster ship, the SS Laurentic, racing to reach Canada before the Montrose could dock. The chase across the Atlantic became international news, with newspapers providing daily updates on the positions of both ships. The SS Laurentic caught up with the SS Montrose in the St. Lawrence River on July 31, 1910, creating one of the most dramatic arrests in criminal history. Inspector Dew, disguised as a pilot coming aboard to guide the ship into port, walked directly up to John Philo Robinson and said the words that would become legendary. "Good morning, Dr. Crippen. I am Inspector Dew from Scotland Yard, and I have a warrant for your arrest." Crippen's reaction was telling. He didn't protest his innocence or claim mistaken identity. Instead, he reportedly said, "Thank God it's over. The suspense has been too much." The arrest made international headlines, transforming the case from murder investigation into global sensation. But it was just the beginning of revelations that would make the Crippen case one of the most sensational trials of the early 20th century. As we near the end of the Crippen case, let's return to the question of intent. Crippen's intent had evolved in stages. First came dissatisfaction with his marriage and infatuation with Ethel. Then came the realization that conventional solutions, divorce, separation, starting over elsewhere, wouldn't give him what he wanted, respectability without consequences. Third came the decision that Cora had to die. But not just die. She had to be erased completely, as if she had never existed. The elaborate cover-up, the forged letters, the fictional death in America, all designed to make it seem like Cora had simply faded away. Fourth came the most revealing phase, celebration. Instead of maintaining the fiction of grief, Crippen immediately began flaunting his new life with Ethel. He gave away Cora's possessions, moved Ethel into the house, even had her wear Cora's jewelry in public. This wasn't the behavior of someone who'd killed in desperation or self-defense. This was someone who felt entitled to his victim's life, who saw murder as a problem-solving technique rather than a crime. But Crippen's fundamental flaw was the same arrogance that had driven him to murder in the first place. He believed he was smarter than everyone else, that his careful planning made him untouchable. That arrogance made him careless. A truly remorseful killer would have maintained the fiction of grief longer, would have been more careful about appearances, would have understood that replacing a wife too quickly would raise suspicions. Instead, Crippen's behavior after the murder revealed the truth about his intent. He hadn't killed Cora because he had to, but because he wanted to. He had enjoyed the process of erasing her and replacing her with the life he preferred. Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen was executed by hanging at Pentonville Prison on November 23, 1910, carrying a photograph of Ethel Leneve close to his heart. Even in his final moments, he was thinking not about the woman he murdered and dismembered, but about the woman he had believed was worth killing for. Ethel Leneve lived another 57 years after Crippen's execution, carrying the weight of her choices. Whether victim or accomplice, she paid a heavy price for her involvement. The great romance that had seemed worth any sacrifice ultimately brought her nothing but decades of hiding and shame. The case changed criminal investigation forever, proving that modern science and technology could reach across continents to bring killers to justice. It showed that the most respectable facades could hide the most heinous crimes. But perhaps most importantly, the Crippen case reminds us that justice depends on ordinary people being willing to trust their instincts and speak up when something seems wrong. Clara Martinelli's decision to go to police, Captain Kendall's willingness to send the wireless message, the neighbors who noticed unusual behavior. These acts of civic courage made the difference between a solved case and a perfect crime. Dr. Crippen believed he could erase his wife's existence and replace her with the life he wanted. Instead, he ensured that Cora Crippen would be remembered long after both of them were forgotten. His intent to commit the perfect crime became the perfect demonstration that some acts are so evil they can never truly be hidden. And in the end, the very technology he thought would aid his escape became the instrument of his capture. That's our exploration of intent in the Crippen case, where respectability became a mask for murder, and modern technology ensured that there was nowhere left to hide. Next time on Deadly Intent, we're examining another case where the intent to commit the perfect crime revealed the darkest impulses of human nature. Until then, remember, every killer has a reason. But does reason ever justify murder?